Hi everyone, welcome to the video today. In today's video, we're going to be exploring Module Federation version 2. This will be a continuation on my previous video where we were looking at Federation 1.5. So in the previous video, we had our micro front end that I've been using kind of throughout my video series, and we upgraded it to RSPack and Federation 1.5, and we kind of left everything in place. So right now we've got kind of the static import of our remote, and we're not really using the Federation runtime yet. In this video, we'll be pulling in the Federation runtime. We'll be looking at ways to dynamically load a remote, what that new API looks like, and ways to make the remote URL dynamic. And there's a couple of different ways you could implement it, but we're going to look at using a runtime plugin to do that. So let's go ahead and get started. So on my screen here, you can see that I've got my same monorepo that I've been using. It's an NX monorepo. I've got the host application and I've got the remote application. And right now they are using NX, so this won't look like your traditional config. I am using RSPack directly, but in the configuration here, you can kind of see where we left off. We're pulling in the Federation plugin from the Module Federation Enhanced package. So that's one thing to note here is we're not consuming the plugin directly from RSPack. This just lets us get kind of the latest version of the package. And previously I was on version 0.1.2. So there have been a lot of updates since then. So we can go to 0.1.13. And basically this will give us a couple new features here. One of them will be, looking at the manifest and the preload remote functionality. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I won't be doing kind of a deep dive on, all of the ways you can use, preload remote or like the manifest in general, but I want to kind of give you an idea of like what it takes to get there, what kind of changes are involved, and some things to kind of look at. So all right, so right now we've upgraded the version of the Federation plugin, and we should probably start with just kind of running the application real quick. And the first thing that we're going to do is just kind of pull up the remote. And again, just to kind of give some familiarity with the setup here, this is really, so basically the kind of hero top part here with the shirt and the logo is basically just coming from the remote. And the idea is that, this whole component, it's the only remote in the application, but that's coming from the other application. And you could see here, 4200, which is my host, and then I've got my remote on 3001. So again, in terms of how this remote is loaded, if we go over to our solution and we go into, kind of the directory here, it's kind of a little bit of a drill down, but you can see that I'm using just kind of that static import. I guess maybe this would be considered more of a dynamic import, but the idea here would be that I'm just doing a regular import statement and I'm pointing it to a path. And I did show last time I added just a label property to my remote just to show that the types are, kind of syncing through, and that's just, a new feature in Federation. And you can see that, reflected here on the product hero. So now at this point, we're not really using anything special. So like as an example, in V2 and 1.5, they've got the concept of the Federation runtime. And the Federation runtime is basically a new kind of object that basically kind of manages, Federation as a whole, right? Previously, if you were aware of it, they were using, various items on the window object and different things like that. And the Federation runtime is just kind of tying everything together and giving one, kind of object instance to, hold all that data and then interact with the information, right? The remotes, shares, plugins, all the various pieces that are, now part of Module Federation. So this is on the official doc site here, and they give you some examples on like kind of how to get started, right? Like we're already using the Federation enhanced package, and they give you an example here of pulling in the runtime from the enhanced package, and then initializing the runtime. Now, what's really interesting here is we'll go back to our application and we'll look in our federation config for our host component, right? Our host app. And you can see that I'm just using just pretty much a static build time remote. And there's no, dynamic pieces to it. I'm not using the runtime. I'm not, seemingly instantiating it in the runtime here. Like you see these kind of remotes being loaded. So, kind of what's the difference with it and, why do I need this initialize call? And for the most part, with module federation being backwards compatible, you can stay on current functionality and you can mix and match some of that functionality now. But as you start to adopt the runtime really needs to be aware of the various pieces that are part of the runtime. So although things are backwards compatible, if I were to go and load a remote, so as an example here, if I just go to my application again, and I come into my console and I type in window, you can see federation. So this is kind of the underlying object for it. And as we look in here, you'll see that I don't have any global plugins. That there's two instances of what they call federation hosts. So effectively, the federation host is the remote. It is the application running federation, and you'll see the various things kind of reflected here. Like you'll see the name of it. In browser, you'll see if it has any plugins. So there's already some of the plugins here that come out of the box. I won't be going into much detail with Snapshot plugin or the Manifest plugin, but I am going to show a little bit about preloading, and I'll cover those other topics later. You'll see that even, the remotes. So this is, kind of under my, let me close this one just so it's more clear, but this is all kind of under my host object here. Um, you'll see the remotes that were registered. You'll see, information about like the sharing scope. It'll tell you which version of the plugin is currently running. There's a lot of nice pieces of information here that let you see things and interact with things in a more structural way. And when you're using existing code, such as like maybe the import remote out of the utils package for like, let's say dynamically loading remote, some of the information may make its way back into federation. It may be compatible, but there are some different ways to kind of hook into it and make sure that things are kind of registering themselves with the runtime. So just as an example, let me see if they have it here, but there is an API for register remotes. So if you're loading a remote through some other means and you wanted to register it with the runtime, and again, this would be after initialization, you can use register remotes. There is a way to basically kind of cache bust and like force load a remote too. If you had to do something like that, you could do that through the register remotes call. I don't really have a good use case for that myself right now. I'm basically just kind of loading a module. One way that maybe something like this could potentially work is maybe you have like a feature flag system, and you've toggled something. Maybe there's like that kind of persistent streaming type connection with the user's browser, and you want to re-register a remote, and you get a different version through that feature flag, and you want to just kind of again bust the module cache and reload the module. So something like register remotes can be pretty, I think, pretty handy there. I don't know if it talks about kind of the impact on like the sharing scope when that happens. Does it reload the application? I haven't been kind of like deep down this particular part yet, but kind of thinking logically through that scenario. If I had remote version 1 and then I went to, I don't know, version 2, and they had a completely different share scope, what's the impact of forcing a load? And that's something again that you'd probably have to test. Again, I don't have a scenario for that in this video, but I do want to cover some of the other features like manifest and snapshot. So, all right, so kind of with some of that talking out of the way, let's kind of get into setting up the runtime. So What's cool about the runtime is the runtime is not part of, any sort of framework, right? So you could pretty much, instantiate it outside of an application. So in my case, it's React, but you could come in here, call it. We'll give it a name. This is the name of my host. It's a terrible name, but and then effectively here you can give it some remotes and you can call initialize. And at this point, if I go back to the application and I try to load it, so if I go back to that window object, you'll see that, pretty much everything more or less looks the same, right? So again, there's not a whole lot has changed since just using instantiation. So let's do this. Let's kind of go in here and let's go to our remotes. And we're going to look at this particular remote here. And what's interesting here is this one is, um, our hero remote in the same mono repo, and it's the remote entry JS. So in this model now, we can actually include, so on the version of Enhanced that I installed, 0.1.13, you can now go and adopt the manifest with the public path setting of auto, which is nice. So like I personally wouldn't use it the other way. I would have waited till 13. So now that functionality is baked in for you and you can use it. And what's really cool about this is you can really kind of see some of the potential with the idea of the manifest. Again, this isn't a deep dive, like the specification for the manifest and how it fits in, what capabilities are developed and exposed around it, I think are still a little bit in flight. But what's nice about the manifest is, you can now, expose information and you could potentially read information about remotes. So a good one is like build version, right? If you've wanted to make a build version in your remote and see what version that is, it's challenging, right? You have to embed it in a module, maybe expose the module, load the module, to see that information. And it's tough because like with the JavaScript version of the remote entry file, you could maybe try to wrap it and do something, kind of proprietary around it, make it work. But in reality, the manifest is a very nice fit, and you'll see that it'll still kind of do the more or less the job of that remote entry file. Is it'll go and basically create this kind of module map that it can load things off of. And it actually works really nicely. And in my opinion, this is a great addition. So again, I'm not going to go into everything you can do with the manifest because I think it's still a pretty new feature, but you can adopt this to load your remote and not use the remote entry file. So if you're on 1.13, that version again, this file is available for you. So just to kind of test the theory out, if we went into our host and our host is going to load this remote, I'll just kind of stop everything just to make sure. But I'll just exchange that remote entry file for the manifest. And if I reload my application here, you'll see that it will fail in this case because it will say that there's a CORS policy issue. So how do we get around the CORS policy? So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our remote. We'll go into the rspack config, and you'll see the dev servers configured here. So I'm going to go ahead and put I'll just restart it just in case, but I'll put kind of the more traditional kind of CORS headers to kind of allow everything, and we'll refresh it. And you'll see that just the screen resolution, so it'll try to hide this remote if the screen's small, but you'll see that that remote still loads. And if I switch over to here, I'm going to just type in mf manifest. You'll see the manifest that's loaded. You'll see that information in there coming from our hero remote. And what's really nice about this, again, is I just swapped the file, right? All I did was install the plugin, and the manifest is now a new build artifact, and I swapped it over and I can now load from it, or I can use the remote entry file, right? So again, it's, heavy emphasis on just, the backwards compatibility and kind of interchangeability between these different things in Federation, which is awesome. So Now I've swapped this over. I'm still in a build time remote. I've got init here, and I don't really have any remotes. This is required, so you at least have to kind of initialize it with an empty array. Um, but let's kind of migrate over to this. And again, you could totally keep this syntax. There's really, no issue with using this syntax. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove it. And just to kind of prove to you that like the site won't work, I do have to restart it. But just to kind of prove it to you, I think there were some, yeah, so it can't resolve. So, Federation, the plugin can't kind of put its, shim magic in there to figure out how to resolve this import. So it doesn't work, right? It stops working. So I'm going to go into remotes here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new remote and I'm going to name it hero. And I'm going to say entry and I'm going to give it the manifest. And this, I think, will still have, let's see here. Let's just restart things. Okay. So just to be clear here, the issue now is that, again, I'm using a traditional import statement, right? So the import statement doesn't have that, federation loading shim that the plugin will, automatically kind of, wrap around your import statement. So again, it's registered here, but when we go to where that component is loaded, it's still loaded this way. And really the problem here with this is that, and maybe you were or weren't aware of it, but Federation will, look at these import statements and it knows based on your Federation config, what's in the remote section, what imports to kind of look at. And if it sees that import that matches the the remote definition in your Federation config, it'll wrap kind of like this loading component around it. And kind of hence going back to the bootstrap file, right? It's got this asynchronous boundary and it can kind of go and resolve, these various things, right? So it does some magic for you. You just aren't aware of it. So we're going to kind of switch this over to use more of a runtime feature, right? So we're using init. We've got it registered here. So if I go back to my application and I go back to window federation, and let me just kind of pull this out a bit. You'll see that I've got just a single, federation host, right? And if I go into options and I go to remote, you'll see the remotes, it is registered, but it just doesn't know how to load it, right? So there is a new way to load remotes if the runtime is aware of it, and it's called the load remote method. So let me pull in the runtime. And basically load remote here is going to be something you can only use if it's registered with the runtime. So you cannot swap this with something like import remote that you might be using right now. So just, to be aware of it. And another nice thing, it's not tied to the framework, right? There's nothing that's tied in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it the same kind of syntax here that let's see here. From couldn't think of the word there, from runtime. And let's see here. So we gave it this. So now you're going to kind of run into, I'm using TypeScript. So if you're using TypeScript, you're going to run into a little type issue. Now, my previous video, I showed you Federation is syncing these types across. So if I came in here and I said import, I think it's just product hero from hero, product hero, you'll see that it does conflict right now, but this should work here. I'm going to just change the name of it here just to avoid a conflict. And let's take a look at this. So you'll see that the type's correct here, right? It's seeing the label, it's pulling that in, and that's, coming from our MF types that are generated, through the Federation plugin. But it's still kind of saying that it doesn't really know what's going on here. And part of this is this kind of definition. So the default for this module is it's not defined yet. It's a generic, or is null. And then you'll see what kind of React Lazy is expecting, which it doesn't like the null part, right? So if I came in here and I just kind of defined something like this, and then I tried to run it, you'll see that like the types, and there's a lot here to digest, but you'll see that the types are correct, right? So this is what we're telling it. And this is what's being returned from the method. And you'll see it's just this kind of return thing here. So I think what you can do here, and there might be a better way to do it, but effectively you want to kind of cast this as can't spell, can't space, product hero. And so if we do something like this, you'll see that it says is void. So, oh, sorry, forgot to return it. Okay, so if you do something like this, then this will kind of type things properly, right? I am, using a typecast here, or maybe it's called an assertion, but you can see that even though this is crazy looking, it is picking up the type correctly, and I can see that it's a string, right? So now that it's kind of switched over, and again, we're using load remote, you'll see that there's no URL here. I can't tell it where to go. I can't pass it a promise. There's no way to go and load it, but I am using the same name that I registered here. Now, obviously, it doesn't have the slash product hero because that's just an exposed module, but the key part is the hero thing. And you can see the remote loads. So now we've kind of swapped out the loading of the remote away from that, kind of dynamic import over to the load remote functionality within the Federation runtime, right? So just to show you again on the runtime, you'll see there's two Federation instances again, and one will be the hero one. So, that continues to kind of line up with our thinking, right? It knows about the Federation runtime, it knows about that. Now, at this point, what if you wanted to load the remote dynamically, right? So loading the remote dynamically, it's an interesting kind of use case here. And what I'll start kind of showing you here is how to go and use a plugin to do this. You could use a build time plugin to do this. So in here, you could go and you could type in, let's see, plugins. This should have picked it up, unless maybe I messed up a type here, but I'm just gonna go into the docs and take a look at, kind of what their example is. And let's just copy this for now. Suppose I could just hit this button and runtime plugins. Here we go. So you've got you've got two, right? You've got your plugins for RS Pack, and then you've got plugins for Federation, and you can register plugins either within your RS Pack config for Federation, or you can register them at runtime, right? You could do it either way. It's really up to you. And again, like just let me go back to the syntax. You'll see it's just under runtime plugins here, and then plugins within in the other thing. So this should be runtime plugins. One thing here just to note is the way that you would actually type check this. So this is coming from an X's Federation config, and you can actually replace this with the one coming from the Federation SDK. So in enhanced, it's got a couple of dependencies that are in there. So if I come in here and I just go and I want to install the SDK here just to kind of grab the types from it, and I want to say it's on the same version, and I should be able to just come in and install it. So this should resolve now, and if I type in runtime plugins, you'll see runtime plugins now shows up, right? So you want to make sure that here I'm just using, a JS file to host my config, but you can still enable, TypeScript checking and get your, your interface kind of imported here through, JS docs, right? So the Federation, the new plugin interface, and if you're using NX, this is the case, right? but it's coming from the SDK, right? It's not coming from the NX packages. So all right, let's go back here. And again, you can register this same code, but just as an example. And let's go back. Let's kind of copy their plugin here again. So now that we've went ahead and just pasted the runtime script in here, right now it is just logging. Let's go ahead and just kind of register it. So we can come into init here, and we will have to pull in the plugin. So the plugin is going to be the dynamic module loader. So we're going to say dynamic plugin from dynamic loader. You'll see that this is a function that returns a plugin instance. So, again, it's just kind of returning this object here, and it's just called my runtime plugin. We're just kind of taking it from the docs, right? So if we restart the application here, and we go and look, we'll see all of the console logs coming from our plugin, right? So the particular hook or lifecycle event that we want to look at here is before request. So what I'm going to do is kind of just delete these out. And we'll go back to the browser real quick, and we're going to just take a look at kind of what comes in on that request. And you'll see the idea here, or ID here, is pretty much my scope and my modules. This is kind of what's being passed into load remote. You'll see an options object, and this will have information about the federation host running it. And you'll see that there's a remotes array, and then you'll see there's the origin. This is the federation host. So this is like, I think this would be considered the, let me see here. Let me expand one of these. Hero module cache options. Okay, so this is definitely the federation host. I guess this is just information about the remote itself, which the remote in this case would be the host, right? So it's the host kind of component here. What I want to do is I want to go in and actually change the URL for my hero remote. So what I'm going to do is take the incoming ID, right? And we kind of know the format here. So we're going to say scope, and then let's pull these apart here, options and origin. So the options is just called options here. And we're going to come in here and we're just going to split it on the /, right? So we're going to just pull that hero kind of name out of it. We're going to go through the origin and let's see here. Let's take a look at the object again. So options remote. So we're going to say options remotes, and we're going to find a remote whose name, and real quick here, there is the concept of an alias. So you could come in here and you could give this an alias. So if you wanted to decouple, the name that's configured in that remote's plugin with the name that's like maybe in a configuration service or something like that, you could give it an alias. In this case, I'm not going to, but just to give you an idea. And then you're just going to say, okay, give me the remote that matches this. And then you could say remote entry. Let's see here. This will be remote or undefined. And just to kind of prove that this works real quick, let's just console log it real fast. And we do have to return. Do we have to return out of this? Yeah, we kind of got to return everything out of this. So instead of just destructuring, I'm just going to take the easy way for now. All right, cool. So I'll refresh it. You'll see that it is finding the remote. So now it's like basically just found it out of the federation host, and it's got this entry property. And we could pretty much just say remote entry, and then we could set a value. So if I try to set entry directly, you'll just see that entry does not exist on type, and it'll say remote, remote with version, remote info common. So one thing we can do is we can import this type here, remote with entry, and you can you could pretty much just cast it, or you could ignore it, whatever you want to do there. But we'll type in the wrong URL just to kind of see, um, see it kind of work here. So this is basically the current URL. And what I'll do is I'm going to come in here, and you'll notice that when I register the remote, I have to provide it either, and like the types here are identical with the other one, remote with version, remote info common. So you're going to see I either have to give it an entry or I've got to give it a version. And it's really kind of up to you what you do here. I don't know what the version is of this remote, and I can put an empty string for entry. So if I want to do that, I can. And then here I'm just setting the URL. So if I come back and I refresh and I test it, you'll see that it'll work. And you'll notice too that even though I put, just to point this out, you can see when it first console logs, it's got the host's URL in there. So if you give it an empty string, it'll kind of make some assumptions, but you could put a fake URL in there, something like that. But just, as an example, you can see it kind of re-pointing it here, right? So if I put in the wrong value and I save it and I try to reload it, it's not going to work, right? So I can use another plugin and I can handle that error, but just as an example here. So now everything works, right? So now, that you could, make this asynchronous if you wanted to, and you could go out and you could call a remote configuration service or feature flags or something like that in the plugin, and you could go and kind of fix the remote version and, have dynamic remotes, right? This would be a replacement for something like import remote. So what's kind of nice about this, again, it only goes before the request to load the remote, and the remote's cached, right? So it's not going to run every time. And you could see that from the log statement. Now, like we've done quite a bit here, right? We've set up dynamic remotes, we've imported some things, we've set up a little bit with the Federation runtime. And now the kind of question becomes, well, like one of the other features here is preload remote. And preload remote is pretty nice because it allows you to preload your remote, and you can kind of selectively choose, modules or exposed components, exposed modules, which ones to preload. So let's kind of show a good example of that. My hero and product hero example is not a good example of that because this is on the home page, right? So it loads kind of right away. And really the problem with that is that there, you're not really going to get a ton of benefit of preloading, maybe a little bit. And when I say a little bit, mainly because like, this is happening very early on in the application, right? It's not kind of, cascading or waiting for certain components to load in React and things like that. So you could very easily preload it here and you might get a little bit of a gain. If you have pages that, let's say 80 or 90% of your users are going to visit, and you really don't want to wait for the user to visit that page to load certain components, right? Then this is a really good use case too. I mean, that this is, I think, kind of what it's made for. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a very simple React component here, and this is in my remote application, and I'm going to go in to the remotes Federation config, and it's in the same folder. So I'm just gonna kind of rename it. Now this remote has now, federated out this additional component. You can see there's no impact on my application, right? So another cool thing is if I go in and I look at the manifest for the remote, you'll see that new widget component is here, along with, the modules that it depends on. And one thing to kind of point out here is you'll see this Federation expose. Now this is like the actual module that you're exposing, like what you're pointing to. Like, so the top level one, not like any dependency, vendor modules. And you'll see one for widget too. So we'll kind of look for these names in the network here. And let me look here. So you'll see that my product hero loads, right? Now, my product hero it's on kind of like the main route, right? So it's going to load and you're going to see that network traffic. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to first import preload remote. And if I go to preload remote, it takes an array, so you can actually preload multiple ones. And you'll see name or alias. So what I can do is I can say hero, and that's all I'm going to change, right? Preload remote hero. And again, this is like pretty much outside of React. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to refresh, and you'll see that this works fine, right? There's no real change in functionality. And you can see product hero, so kind of loading as intended there. And you could come into, let's look at the documentation real quick for preload remote. So there's some features on here that, again, I'm not going to talk through all of them in the video here. You'll see the name or alias of the preloaded remote module. So we would type in something like hero here, right? Exposes. So this is interesting. The specific expose of the preloaded module, by default, all exposes are preloaded. When provide exposes, only specific exposes are preloaded. So this is cool because you can come in here and you can target which particular, expose you want to preload instead of, fetching all of them. If the remote had a lot of exports, that would be nice. You could be very, very selective about it. Resource category, preloads, synchronous chunks, reference, asynchronous chunks. I believe, I don't know much about this feature, but I think it's related to other things like CSS and other, other pieces of it. Asynchronous ref chunks. It could be maybe vendor modules, things exposed to it. Dependencies loads all submodule dependencies. Okay, so I think this would mean dependent remotes, right? So if your remote depends on a remote, etc. Filtering, after configuration, unnecessary resources are filtered out. So probably just gives you a way to maybe filter down, those chunks that you see in the manifest. So, all right. So let's kind of go back to this here. I'm going to just kind of restart everything. And let's take a look at what we've got going on. So I'm going to go into my Federation runtime here. Failed to get manifest JSON for hero. The manifest URL is this. Please ensure the manifest URL is accessible. So in this case, going and preloading a remote, let's see here, might be kind of challenging, right? So go to load the remote here, you'll notice that it'll complain that it's unable to find the manifest. So you'll see that the remote will still load, but it's not able to successfully preload the remote. So, again, it's loading, but it's not preloading. And the way we can kind of verify that too is we only see our product hero component here being loaded. We don't see our widget component being loaded. And the issue here is that, again, you can kind of see it here for a second. One thing is don't always trust console logs. Console logs that happen in your browser are like eventually consistent, right? They're asynchronous. So sometimes, and you can kind of see it here, you'll see one value in the string interpretation and another value in the expanded form. And it's one of it's because it's I think one is a more of a string like copy of it, and the other one's a reference to the object. So you can see the reference is updated, but you can even see in the error message here, it sees the old version by the time when it's trying to load. So when we go back in here, we're on the before request hook. This one is very specific to like load remote, but there are lots of hooks in here, and one of them is before preload remote. So you can come in here, and I'm just going to copy pretty much this same method we have in here, except a little different. When you look at this lifecycle event before request, I'm able to get types on all of these correctly. like this works correctly. When I come into preload remote, it has kind of the same thing here, but like, so as an example, one of them is preload ops, options, or origin, and they should exist on this overall object, right? Well, when I come into here, you'll see that it's typed as any. So I want to say that this is kind of a kind of an oddity. I don't know if it's my IDE. I don't know if it's just maybe a small bug in the package, but um, I don't really have types for any of these. So I'm going to come into just preload remotes. This is just another phase here, and I would have basically the same logic, right? It's asynchronous. I could call out, fetch this URL and then put it back in the application. So if I refresh now, you'll see the error is gone, and you'll see there's an additional get call for widget. So this is, that new remote component. And right now I don't actually consume it in my application. So let's just go quickly kind of pick a page. I'll put it on the cart page for now, and I'll put it here. So what I'm going to do is just kind of come in and let's steal this kind of bootstrap code, and I'm going to go add, and the very first thing you'll see here is I don't have the types for this anymore. And it's because I mentioned this in my previous video, the types are only going to generate based on what's in your config, right? So if I come back in here and I add back hero and I give it that URL, let me just add this in here. And I'm just going to kind of rebuild. It should pull in the latest types because again, this is, kind of a build time thing. So it doesn't know about your code files. But if I come in here, now you'll see widget appear, and I'm not actually using these, so I'm just going to remove it, and we'll just restart it just in case. So now we can come in here and we can say widget, and I'll just kind of name it a little differently. I'm going to pull in React, and I'm going to pull in load remote. We're going to give it the right type. We're going to point it here. And then I can say widget. And now here's the really cool thing, right? So if I go and I load this page and I go to cart, you'll see my widget loads. And again, I'm going to refresh here and you'll see the network call for widget. I'm going to just clear it. You'll see there's no network call, right? It's preloaded. So it's ready to go, and I can use this, right away, right? So again, this is, a really useful kind of piece of functionality here where I can go and I could take maybe a very commonly hit component that might not be like, in the hot path, like your entry point, and go and preload this. Now, what's also really cool about this too is, again, I can give it the alias, and then I can also figure out like what to expose. So if I said expose product hero, and let's go and refresh, you'll see that the widget component is still, is only loaded when I go to it, right? So that there's an issue with the router, but basically, it's not preloading that particular component, which is nice. So again, if you have like 50 exposes, you wouldn't really want to preload them all. And I can also say, hey, just preload the widget, and you can see the widget's back here, and it works. So that kind of wraps up most I want to talk about. It's a lengthy video to go through simple functionality, but I like giving kind of the explanation and the walkthrough of things kind of as we're moving through them. The kind of interesting parts with the runtime is that it's still pretty new, right? There's some functionality that is available and that's hanging off of it, but and even though there's a lot of backwards compatibility, it is a newer feature. So I think being compatible with the runtime and adopting the runtime into your application is likely the right move. There are more advanced use cases of plugins and the runtime and things that I just haven't covered in this video. But kind of moving into V2, even if you are in a working state with backwards compatibility, I would definitely look at adopting the runtime what's available to you and what's kind of the best path to get there, even though there are some, small changes between maybe running code directly in your framework or, maybe running code through a plugin. Anyhow, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.